every time I install a piece, it's like this sort of cathartic experience for me where like the more it becomes final, the more traumatic it is for me, because as I'll talk about a little bit, a lot of the concepts that underlie the work, you know, you see them at the end and it's kind of like this field, and we all have kind of that experience, right? And so there's kind of that human element that is that connection that we can all kind of relate to, and that helps people, you know, approach the work. For me, that's not how it starts. It starts somewhere way back in a place that I have a hard time even getting to, and the closer it gets to that kind of specificity, the more kind of challenging it is for me, because it's always better in my head than it is when it's actually installed. And that's why all the work that I'm going to show you today is never really finished, and that's kind of how I design it and how I engineer it. And every time it goes up, it changes, and that's why they're always installations. They're engineered to be installations, they're designed to be installations, but they also have a lot of engineering connections in between them, right? Which actually makes it an interesting process to design something that has very specific engineering constraints in a way that it still allows you the flexibility to kind of mess it all up and do it all over again somewhere else. So just a little bit on the inception of this particular piece. A lot of my work has to do with these points of interaction. So in this particular piece, you know, there's a lot of interactions going on in terms of the inception of the work. If you imagine that field, you imagine that beach, you imagine that ocean, you imagine that wind, there's all this stuff going on. And that's where the interesting things happen, right? Where you have those mixtures, you have those forces, you have those physical systems that are all kind of coming together and working their magic upon each other. And the interesting thing about that is, number one, like, you know, that's what we call nature. That's really beautiful. You have the juxtapositions of the colors and the materials and the forces, and you can kind of feel all that, and you can see all that, you can experience all that. But it also tells you something about kind of the underlying structure of the world, right? Because when you see those things, when you see those forces, they have this certain internal logic that makes you kind of want to understand more, right? So it kind of like opens up a little bit of like kind of, you know, what's underneath reality, if you will. It almost is a bit like, I think about that apocryphal tale of Sir Isaac Newton getting hit on the head by the apple, right? And all of a sudden you're like, oh, like things fall down. Isn't that interesting? And you start to kind of like work back and get into the details of the rules. And I think those details and those rules, there's this kind of just fundamental underlying beauty, which is a place that I kind of oftentimes like to probe creatively. Also, that piece is about memories, and this particular image isn't about memories, and yet it kind of is, because memories, you know, there's this quality of duality or juxtaposition to memories, right? Like that you take something that you experience that's rational, and you kind of associate emotion with it, you associate affect with it. And so as a result, all of us experience the same things in slightly different ways, right? Because in our heads, we're not remembering everything like a tape recorder. We're remembering things with our own thoughts and our own feelings and our own emotions and coloring that experience. And yet at the same time, you know, we've got an overlap in terms of, you know, what we're all experiencing together. And it's those overlaps of kind of, you know, the way that I remember it versus the way that you remember it, but the fact that we all remember the same thing, but we're like thinking different things in our heads is an interesting interaction for me. And this is from a piece that I'll show you in a little bit called Branching Systems, where it's just that nice summation of kind of that rational and then the affective together. Here it's the technological and the natural, right? Like put together in this interesting kind of way that I like, at least. So these are my materials. This is my art supply store, and I put this up primarily because when I was going through and crafting this particular presentation, I was thinking specifically about this piece, which is one of the first pieces that I ever actually did. And way back before I started doing art, I was actually, as Alice was saying, an interaction designer and working with, you know, apply creativity to computers in the form of design. And at some point in time, as I got more and more familiar with the computer side of things, because I don't have that technical background, I realized that you could do the same sorts of things outside of the computer that you could do inside the computer. So I was working with animation inside the computer, and animation and algorithmic animation, so kind of code-driven animation inside the computer, and realized that, you know, that same code, that same process with a little bit more work, you can actually make things move outside the computer. And for me, like, once you free it from the computer, like once you realize you can do stuff in the real world, then all of a sudden you're like, well, yeah, it's interesting. And I still, you know, I love this guy, and I still, you know, do stuff on here professionally, but there is something about, you know, interacting with work, interacting with people, you know, interacting with things in the real world in an embodied, you know, experience that, you know, just the palpability, it's magic. So basically, to make a long story short, I did what I needed to do to kind of figure out how to work with these magical materials, really, to borrow Alice's term. And they are like totally amazing, because I don't know if there's anybody in the audience who's an engineer, but like, you're totally like awesome and you understand the magic. For those that don't, this is the DigiKey catalog. There's a number of companies like this, and it's literally the size of a phone book, and it's just like pages and pages and pages of stuff, right? Little magic bits that you can put together and like do things in, you know, whatever way you want them to, if you figure out the right recipe to kind of structure all that stuff. And this was something that I had like no idea existed, but like, you know, you figure out what you want to do and you kind of begin to put the pieces together. This is another one of those phone books. It's a McMaster Carr catalog. If civilization died tomorrow, you'd want one of these, and you could put it back together relatively quickly again. This is actually some of the pages out of technical manual for the microcontrollers that are actually running the piece upstairs. Okay, so this is fascinating to me, the appropriation of, you know, one domain to another, right? And I think what's probably as exciting to me as anything else I'll talk to you about tonight is the fact that, you know, I'm not supposed to be working here somehow. Like, it feels a little dirty and a little secret that you kind of like go someplace that you're not supposed to, and that makes everything just a little bit more memorable and a little bit more exciting. And it's that way for me with engineering materials, because it really is just kind of amazing the stuff that you have access to. And all you have to do is like figure out how to decipher it all and try and get it to work a little bit. These are some board layouts from the piece upstairs. I'm happy to get into detail about these as we see fit. But again, just another example of some of the artistic tools that are necessary to actually be able to create in this particular type of medium. So all the boards that are up there are custom designed for this particular piece. And I think there's actually an example of one of the earlier boards from this piece, but a previous iteration that had actually been shown, and you can even draw little pictures on the boards if you want to, which I always thought was kind of cool. These boards are an earlier version of that piece that actually is just a linear string, and at some point in time I kind of broke that out into multiple dimensions and figured out how to actually array that around space. And just to kind of, that microcontroller is one of the things that allows you to do that. It's an interesting technology, because when you talk about the will of the artist as it relates to a work, that's one of those places that the manifestation of that intent, you can actually structure that, and you can actually have that chip behave in a way that you want it to. Not just have the piece look like you want it to, or feel like you want it to, or sound like you want it to, but behave and interact and respond to an environment. And all of that is, you know, kind of, it's like I left a little bit of myself in a space, and it can kind of perform as I would like it to, right? And I can actually allow it to vary its performance based on factors in the environment. That's always just been a fascinating thing to me. It's also what allows pieces like the one upstairs to be programmed to a space, because that piece, if you see it, it has a sense of wind blowing across the space, and in order to affect that, each of those individual boards needs to understand where it is in the space relative to each other. So all those have to be programmed, all those have to understand and behave appropriately for that really system, that virtual system that they're creating in that space that really kind of is mapped to the physical space. Wires, yeah. So this is, as I was going back over things for this piece, again, it's an earlier piece, and I realized that this was one of those things that I had to figure out what to do with the wires, because anytime that you work with any type of electronics, you always have wires, unless you're doing little portable temporary stuff like batteries. The standard model, I will say, of dealing with this is kind of trying to squirrel them away, and otherwise just sort of like make them as imperceptible as possible. And really early on, I just kind of went the opposite direction on that and decided that there's something exciting about the wires, and there's something exciting about the wires because I think when we squirrel them away, you lose a sense of the magic of the system itself that's running things, right? Like we create these systems, and then it's what the system is kind of presenting that is supposed to be what we're paying attention to, and like nothing that underlies it is supposed to be kind of, you don't see that. That's just kind of behind the curtain. For me, and maybe this is kind of similar to the engineering catalogs I showed you earlier, but what's behind the curtain is really, really kind of cool. And so I'm really interested in that kind of behind the curtain, and also the beauty, because I think as a constraint on the system, it's easy to pretend things don't exist. I think it's harder to actually find a way to elegantly deal with them, but the benefit of that, at least for me, is that you oftentimes find yourself, discovering things that you wouldn't have if you took that easier route. And so I kind of like the wires. And for this particular piece, this originally started out, again, I'll have some images in here of the older work, but what I realized as I worked with it was that it actually, the wire creates a landscape, right? And that landscape actually adds to the piece. If I had just hidden that away, it's not as interesting of a work, but the illusions that got brought about by kind of a respect of the material is something that is a pretty consistent theme in my work. This wire, I will note, is this is one of those exciting little things of being on the phone with 18 different wire manufacturers trying to order wire by color, which let me tell you, engineers are just like, what do you mean, kind of wheat, but I'm not coppery, I don't want the copper, I want the, well, but why? And I'm like, oh, it's, So this is, I forget the exact composition, so it's got two different plastics over it with an enamel coating that all kind of make it just the right shade of color that I kind of need for this particular piece. These are some of the wires from the previous version of this, that green board that I showed you. And in this particular piece, there's that kind of root-like quality to them, right? And these have boards below, and there's this interesting sort of almost sense of being planted. And you've got the boards underneath, and then you've got these kind of root-like structures coming up. And then all of a sudden, you discover the similarities in between these technical systems and the natural systems that they're sort of referencing, and then you kind of take a step further than that and you realize that it's kind of all technical systems. Some are man-made, some are not man-made, but it's really about that structure and how successful that structure is. That's actually really what makes things interesting or not interesting, whether they're plants or whether they're little robots that look like plants. Here's another kind of close-up of an installation, I think, in New York with that sort of, just nice little landscape quality to it. And variables. So this is what I was talking about earlier. This is a piece called Branching Systems, which I forget where exact this is being installed, but here you've just sort of blown the wire issue out into a whole other level of complexity. But also, there's that same idea of variability, right? So with this piece, it has literally hundreds of little motors and little wings and 20-foot spans of wire, and it's literally miles and miles and miles of wire. And then these little circuit boards that actually are hexagons and plug into one another, right? So the entire shape of the piece is modular. You've got all this wire, and I'll show, actually I'll go back here real quick. All this wire that allows you to really kind of just shape it to the needs of the space again, right? And this piece is the same piece every time, but also incredibly different depending on where it gets installed. And this is on the wire side of things, just another example of one from an installation at the IMOC in Indianapolis, and I think this might be from Istanbul. And just that particular piece, the respect of the lines on the wall. This one, you've got that allusion to the natural systems again, but it just lets you do some interesting things. I like the wire, I guess is what I'm saying. This is branching systems in, I want to say, Shanghai, I believe. And again, just like working with what we had in that space there, hanging stuff from the overhead. And this, like you can imagine, this piece comes, and as all these pieces do, like they all pack tight, right? It's like all your little circuit boards, it's like all your wire rolled up. It's like an insane amount of production to actually put all that together. It really is like third world sweatshop levels of production. But it all packs up really tight and just kind of explodes out into a space, and over the course of several days, it comes together in a way that feels right for me. And that's the thing that, like, if I was just making the work and making it once, I probably would not make any more work because it wouldn't hold my attention, honestly. But the fact that, for me, it's an experience of exploration, even at the point of installing the piece that I've installed 20 times before, but every time it's going to be different. The only consistency will be it'll be a pain in the ass every single time. But the piece itself, I'll find something new in it. Every time I find something new in it. This is Kiev, showing Kiev. This is actually fairly low res, but it's interesting. This building, actually, they'll do things in Kiev that we couldn't just do here, where this building would literally be just condemned and you could never go in it. But it's this beautiful space, and they had this giant show in it, and you just get to take it over and allow stuff to take root. It's a close up there. This is just on a wall, that same piece, branching systems, but really almost just like two-dimensional and arrayed out over this wall, and kind of even curling around some corners. And again, like the mass in New York. So the point is that variability is just a consistent theme in everything that's going on, along with this idea of evolution. And I showed you some earlier examples from the pieces upstairs, and there's typically a progression for me with these works because there's a lot of engineering investment up front, and I'm trying to figure out what exactly I think I'm building early on, and then trying to find a way to scale that appropriately, learn what I need to learn to actually build systems that will function on top of the concept, and then also making sure that they are robust enough technically to actually be able to perform the way that I want them to, which is a combination of a lot of kind of electrical engineering and some mechanical and materials engineering, and then also a lot of programming, none of which I'm expert at, but I'm good enough at all of them to be able to kind of like not be too worried about trying to put it together, or I'm blissfully ignorant of my own ignorance, maybe a good way to put it. But also what happens is this is actually a piece called Numa that was installed in Basel. And this piece is actually using a lot of the same technical infrastructure as that branching systems piece I showed you before, just doing some very different things and some similar things, and installed in a very different way. In this very large former train station in Basel, instead of the wings, instead of the little leaf guys, there's actually these little mirrors that sort of reflect the entire space and are continually moving. And then there was these actuated umbrellas that were hung from the ceiling. And I actually, when I left this piece, I had a cell phone and a heartbeat monitor and basically a sensor for breath. And when I was back, I think I was in Seattle at the time, but my breathing was actually manifest in this space in Basel. And the whole kind of reason for that was because I'd done enough installations in various parts of the world, and it was always this kind of weirdly traumatic experience for me where I like fly over, I don't sleep for 4 days, like everybody else like comes in and they like hang something and they leave, and I'm like watching them like, oh, that must be nice, and then they like go on tours and stuff and send me pictures. I'm usually like trying to get things to work or just kind of dialing them in the way that I want them to. Sometimes too much flexibility is not a good thing. This particular piece came out partly out of a desire for me to feel like I was still there even after I'd left. That like I always leave and then the piece is there and half the time I don't even know what happened to it, or people liking it or not liking it. Is it like going well, is it not? And here I actually was able to leave a little bit more of myself behind in an active manner. It just felt good to me at the time. I think I should have a little, there's the monitor. Oh, and here's the guys actually moving from the ceiling here as I'm breathing. And that was fun to actuate the umbrellas in a way that they could actually just do that over and over and over again, so you learn fun stuff every time through. And you can see the piece actually hanging from that ceiling, which is like 40 feet up, and it's just like all this cable that's hanging down in this huge massive circuit boards and lights, and then all the little mirrors just kind of moving around all over the place. Those mirrors actually have, or the wings I should say, have, there's the math, have little sensors on them. So that's not just about actuation, but each of those boards has a little microcontroller. It's running a couple pairs of wings, and the wings all have light sensors on them. So when you come up, they're not actually moving when you come up to them. What they're doing is they're feeding that kind of environmental sensing back into the system, and the system is integrating that. So it's not a one-for-one, like the wings are moving when somebody walks by, but it's more stuff's happening on the outside, and then stuff's happening on the inside, and then stuff's happening on the outside, and you get that kind of virtuous circle. And that's also a continual theme in my work, that idea that there's this sort of, again, this internal system, right? This internal story that's going on in the context of those circuit boards and those microprocessors, that has its own poetry and that has its own structure and that has its own reason for being even. And we get to see little bits of the expression of that on the outside, and they get to see little bits of the expression from us, and it's kind of, who's right, who's wrong, like everybody's got their little space. So this is a piece that is called Perfect Storm, which I've shown a couple times in Miami and in Russia and Berlin, I think. And this is almost the opposite of some of the work that you've seen here before, where we're dealing with the physical systems and kind of manifesting themselves in an environment. Here, this is trying to take a virtual space, like virtual activity, but map it to the real world. So this particular piece is actually made with real plants in my studio, and I wish I had a picture, I didn't have one here, this crazy setup of multiple screens with real plants and one-for-one cameras in front of each screen so that you're getting the actual perspective of sitting in front of that, and as a result you're basically relating what's being taken in the camera back to that screen in a one-for-one manner. So you're trying to kind of, again, close that loop as much as possible, and through basically the material choices here and in the way that it's filmed, it feels like fairly realistic in terms of just that space on the other side, right, and the activity on the other side. And there's a little bit of the video from this guy, and it's actually it's a beautiful piece. It's interesting. I was telling Alice earlier, you see the relationship to the work upstairs. It's working with similar themes. It's using different techniques to actually explore some of those fundamental forces, and not just the forces, but also we're working with systems that have what I consider to be baseline sort of human elements, right? So all of us relate to nature, all of us relate to grass and trees, and that kicks in memories for all of us. That kind of universal relatability is, I think, one of the reasons that I keep coming back to this theme, just because it allows me to be able to work with the technical side in a way that's still very human and very relatable. So it's kind of just my shortcut that gets things to a place that feels comfortable for me to offset some of the complexity that's going on the other side of things. So it just provides a nice balance. This particular piece on the evolution side, and I don't have the video of this, I apologize, I do somewhere, is this piece in Russia where I took the same components and actually began to play with them in an entirely different way. So this piece just adds a monitor and duplicates what's going on in that video, right? And all of a sudden you get a couple things. One is this completely different sort of feel to the system, because before, when you're just kind of taking wind left to right, there's a lot of rationality there. You get what's going on here. It's almost like this explosion coming out of the middle, and it feels very much like this leafy Rorschach test in real time, and it has a little bit of a ominous quality, and it's interesting how just a little bit of evolution to the same basic system can change things in such a fundamental way, which is one of the reasons that I like to be able to design things so that they can kind of extend out, because usually by the time I've gotten them working the way that I want them to, I want to be able to kind of push in on some of the conceptual elements of them. Oh, misbehaving, I did label that, yeah. So this is, I say misbehaving here because it's breaking certain rules, this piece, or maybe just breaking rules for me, because once you actually switch over to the other side, so I've done a number of pieces that were robotic or mechatronic, very technical, exploring certain fundamental, natural and physical themes. And at some point in time, I decided that I wanted to kind of turn that on its head and actually work with real natural systems. So this is a piece called Study for Lit from Within. And it basically uses horsetail plants, which you probably see here. They get used in a lot of architectural installations. A lot of people think they're bamboo. They're actually related to grass. They're very ancient. They're segmented. They're hollow in the middle, and I worked with these for a while to figure out a way to basically find LEDs with the appropriate spectral qualities. Well, not even LEDs. I wanted to find a way to light them from the inside and actually have them live and photosynthesize from the inside. And this was something that, for me, once I started kicking around the conceptual idea of it, it just seems so fascinating, this idea that you could break that natural dependence, and at least, in terms of the concept that you could not be reliant on, the sun if you're a plant, that you could kind of, live, with this light shining from the inside out and kind of just turn the tables on everything. And there was something about it that just seemed like so awesomely, like, wouldn't that be awesome if I just kind of was totally self-contained, and I don't know, it's totally bizarre too at the same time. So these pieces, these plants basically get very small, very small LEDs surgically embedded in them that are chosen for their specific spectral qualities to enable the plant to actually photosynthesize, and are driven in a manner that doesn't heat them up so much that it presents a problem to the plant. So you can basically have these plants in total darkness, and they're tough, and they'll actually live. So this is an installation in New York. The little bags here are actually filled with soil. The little lights are the boards on the backs of the bags that are actually running an animation. So these aren't just lit, but what happens is, because they're all segmented, all of this, of course, is networked together in a hugely complex and inefficient manner that enables basically that animation to look like it's liquid, kind of like flowing through those plants as it's animated up and down in waves. And there's actually, on my site, there's a video of that, but it has me talking, and I just can't hear myself talking, so it freaks me out. So this is actually the installation in Moscow that I did, I think just a little less than a year ago now. And this piece, again, same kind of variability. So you've got a lot of tight coupling in terms of your technical constraints, in terms of things you need to do to make the piece work, but you also have a lot of variability. So when we go into the space, I've got materials and I've got a structure, but that structure is a recipe, right? And the space is the element that's missing that allows me to actually kind of coalesce what is otherwise, an unknown into a known, right? It's kind of like Schrodinger's cat. We figure out, is it alive or dead? Because up until that point, it's both. And this piece, I think there's some bigger, yeah. So you can see it's actually pretty big. It's 3 different lines of these guys. That ability to relate on a human scale is something that is also a consistent theme in my work. So how people are going to interact with the piece, how they're going to come into it, how they're going to see it, just what the physicality of the work is relative to the viewer is something that is always kind of top of mind for me. That's just, for me, the difference between something that is real and something that is less than real, and I always try and come to the table with as much reality as possible. So this last piece is something that I'm working on currently, along with a couple other things. This is kind of a large-scale conceptual piece right now, actually, and it's comprised of 3 Japanese maples, which are deciduous trees, which means that they kind of have a cycle of summer to fall to winter to spring. And these are all genetic clones, so they're effectively the same tree, right? Just grown 3 different times. And then the lighting and the environmental control on those 3 trees is slowly pushed out of phase, which you can do in a specific manner over a certain period of time, such that it's the same tree, like existing in 4 different places, and those 4 different places are actually 4 different seasons, right? So like as this guy is going through fall, you see the one next to him is going, he's already lost all his leaves. This guy's budding, this guy's in full summer. I've got another view of this, I think, here. And this is one of those, again, like working with the living systems, working with the technology, figuring out where you can push each, just like you saw in that kind of last installation that I did in Moscow. You're not pushing one or the other. You're not being delicate with the technology. You're not being delicate with the plants. A lot of people actually, especially the piece I got installed in Moscow that I just showed you, you see the technology and the plants kind of literally like merged together. And it's like, you've done surgery on these plants, and a lot of people get very uncomfortable with that. I was actually thinking about that in Moscow, why that's the case, because it's a plant, and he'll still be fine after. But I think that you bring these elements together and it reminds you, at least it reminds me, just how much we're dependent on that technology, right? Like there's this fallacy to think that somehow, you're kind of doing something that you haven't already done to yourself, right? We're all dependent on it. We all have it integrated in all sorts of different ways, even, probably all of us in our bodies as well. We don't think of it that way, or sometimes we don't like to think of it that way, because of course we want to think of ourselves as being, 100% natural, and yet, we're symbiotic. We marry all these things together, and I think it's interesting to be able to express that reality back out again, because ultimately, for all of my work, especially when I'm dealing with the actual organisms themselves, for me, that is ultimately about underlying structure, right? It's the success of those systems, whether it's a natural system, whether it's a technical system, something functions and it reproduces, for plants, that means one thing. For a piece of art, that means another thing, but you have kind of viability and a way to measure that, and a way to see whether something's successful or not. It's the same thing on the technical side. You either engineered something so it functions or you haven't, and ultimately that structure and the success of that structure and the underlying organization is the thing that really makes me most excited and is the kind of concepts that I tend to be playing around with in all of this work. So that's what I have to show. I'd be happy to answer any questions if you have any about the piece upstairs or anything else.